All right. Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending upon which time zone you're in. And welcome to our Winfield United Facebook Live broadcast. Today, we are talking about mitigating early season stress. So, reducing early season stress in your crops. My name is Kyle Gustafson. I am a regional agronomist with Winfield United. I am based in South Dakota, and I will let my counterpart introduce himself as well.
Yes, my name is Mark Heineman. I'm a Winfield United agronomist who resides in Nebraska. So welcome, and we appreciate you tuning in.
So one of the things we want to start off by just mentioning is if you have any questions, make sure you put them in the comments. We'll try to make sure that we get them addressed in a timely manner. And let's get started. So when we start thinking about, how important it is to mitigate early season stress, there's been a lot of conversations this spring so far, or late winter, early spring, and there's a lot of producers that are talking about wanting to plant earlier. It's hard to imagine thinking about planting earlier right now. We just got done with an unprecedented cold snap, but there's a lot of people talking about wanting to plant early. And this is what it really comes down to right now is as you look across those top three bars right there, those really describe the importance of getting your corn out of the ground as fast as possible. If corn is delayed a week and a half emerging, that that results in 5% yield loss. If your corn is 3 weeks or more later, that results in at least a 12%, if not greater, yield loss. Now, I know there's some people probably on who are from the northern parts of the country, and you might say, well, I've had it in the past where I've had my corn in the ground for 4 or 5, maybe even 6 weeks before it came out of the ground. It's important to remember this type of information that we're going to be sharing is specifically designed for you because, again, we want to minimize the amount of time that crop is in the ground. We want to maximize how quickly it comes out of the ground, and we want to maximize that early season vigor. So that's what a little bit of the science tells us. Mark, what do we know about producer feelings around these stress mitigation strategies?
So that's a great place to start, Kyle. I think most of the time when we think about what we can do to minimize something or enhance something, a good place to start is what do growers tell us? So what we got here is our 2019 corn yield contest. And so when we think about what that tells us and how they minimize early season stress mitigation, specifically around starter percent. If we look at the number of national winners who utilize starters, 81% of them utilize a starter. Then if we think about the rest of the entrants, that's about 65% that use starters. So we reduce the amount of people adopting starters. But then if we look at growers nationwide that plant corn, about 25% of them only use a starter. So just looking at it in general, when we think about increasing our yield, reducing early stress mitigation, starters have been showing good value to a lot of these national winners when we think about realizing the value of getting our corn off to a good start and best possible start that we can. So when we look at that information, we still see a continuation of versus adoption of starters remaining high in there. So if we continue to talk about starters even more, our next slide will give us a good understanding about what we think about when we look at starters. And so we'll specifically look at phosphorus starter. So when we think about when we're putting that corn in the ground, and Kyle did a great job explaining about how we put our corn in there early and growers tended to put our corn in the ground earlier. And if you're in a northern environment, the struggles of what our soil temperatures can have on that stress. So if we look at soil temperature and the impact it has on phosphorus availability, if our soil temperature is 55 degrees, it's telling us that we have about 31% of our phosphorus being available. So what should we do? So even if we have a high phosphorus soil, Kyle, a lot of growers say, well, I shouldn't have to worry about that phosphorus, but that tells us that with our soil temperature, it impacts that available phosphorus. So the way we can do is make sure we can put a banded phosphorus out there, make sure that we can able to minimize that effect that cool soil has for available phosphorus. Also, we know that soil temperature has an impact on plant root growth if it's really cold and wet. So we will also want to minimize that, putting a band out there, making sure we can drive early root development as well. So if we continue on to our starter continuation, what else should we worry about when it comes to the nutritional factor? So what we want to showcase here is on the right, we have two pictures. The one in the middle has no zinc on the seed. And then on the right, we have a zinc applied to a seed treatment. So this is a seed treatment demo. But you can see how visually that zinc was important for early stand establishment and early vigor out there. So when we think about impacts of zinc out there, when we look at our next graph to the left, we can see that in the soil, zinc at high amounts impacts iron, but then also if we got high levels of calcium and phosphorus, that can impact our zinc uptake. So if you got growers, or if you're a grower who grows corn on soils that are high calcium and high phosphorus, that impacts our zinc availability. So we want to think about the right form of zinc that we utilize in those situations. Plus, we also want to talk about synergisms. We know that zinc plus phosphorus is critical for early plant growth, and we know if we have a proper amount of zinc, it can increase the plant available phosphorus as well as potassium. So those are critical when we're thinking about these natural plant interactions and synergisms that we talk about within our starter applications. So I see we got a question here that popped up, and we appreciate the question. We have sometimes growers that ask, well, I've tried starters before and it seemed like they didn't have value. Or should I consider starters if I've used them before in the past? And I think this is a question that is real, and a question that we want to discuss a little bit about is if we're thinking about using starters, I think several things have changed. I think we've increased our planning, or we've brought our planting date up a little bit closer. So we're planting in cooler soils. A couple other things that might have happened with growers is we're actually reducing our tillage, or we're getting into no-till. There seems to be some adoption happening with cover crops out there. So those things all play in the factor. And I think if we sit down and talk with growers, they've started implementing several different practices. And I think one of the things when we're chasing the yield potential of these hybrids we're planting out there, starters have shown their value out there when we're reducing early season stress mitigation. And we also can make sure we have an early plant available form of our nutrients that we have out there when we're planting corn. So I would encourage you, if you've used them in the past, doesn't seem like you've had a result, I think we could see some value in those, especially if we're chasing higher end yields out there with our genetic potentials out there. So Kyle, know that we're talking about there's interaction between zinc and phosphorus in our starters. Is there other things that we could be looking at, including into our starter application?
Yeah, let's take this one step further. Mark did an excellent job of weaving us through the why of starter, the phosphorus, the zinc. Let's take this great program and make it excellent. So the last component that we think about adding to a starter fertilizer is a PGR such as Ascend. So to think of this kind of like a growth hormone, if you will, that helps that crop grow faster. We've been doing a lot of research over a number of years on Ascend, and one of the things that we find is that it maximizes its response in cool, wet conditions. What conditions are we talking about here today? We're talking about early season stressful conditions, so we're talking about cool, wet conditions. One of the things that we know as we were talking about phosphorus and zinc is that, for example, zinc, when zinc is applied, it almost creates an auxin-like response. So auxin is a plant growth regulator. Zinc can make a crop grow faster. So we actually know that there's a positive response or interaction, if you will, between Ascend and zinc. So as we think about all these factors to getting your corn off to a good start, one thing we didn't talk about at the beginning is, we know corn germinates at a 50-degree soil temperature. These are components that can help when that crop or that soil is close to 50 degrees. It can help that corn get off to a good start early when soil temperatures are cooler. Now, we've talked a lot so far about corn. Let's jump over and let's talk a little bit about soybeans too. Now, in the last couple of years, it's been a general trend that we are thinking about planting our soybeans actually before our corn. Although it might seem backwards based on germination temperatures, there's a lot of people talking about planting soybeans earlier. And if you're going to be planting soybeans early, one of the things that you have to be thinking about doing is, how do I mitigate stress on early planted soybeans? One of the best tools that you have in your toolbox to use is using a soybean seed treatment that contains a fungicide and an insecticide component. So what you're looking at here in front of you are two different plots. They both have the exact same rate of fungicide applied on them, but the plot on the right, which is Warden CX, is a fungicide plus an insecticide. Now, why might we be seeing these responses? Well, one of the things that we know is that when it comes to soybean diseases and soybean insects, oftentimes we judge a soybean stand by its final stand. And when you think about diseases and insects, there are nibblers and there are killers. Killers are the diseases or insects that fully kill that plant and creates a gap in the stand. And those are the ones that are really easy to visualize. But there are also diseases or insects that nibble, if you will. They nibble on the roots. They never actually kill the plant. But what they do is they end up reducing the vigor on that plant early. And one of the things we know is that as you plant into cooler, wetter conditions, you have more disease pressure. You can also have more early season insect pressure. So the other thing to think about too is there's some real value in using a seed treatment in soybeans. Now I see there are a couple of questions here, and let's dive right into them. Our first question here: is there any data that supports using soybean seed treatments? That's an excellent question. One that I can think of immediately is there is a lot of university data that supports, especially nowadays as we keep pushing our soybean populations, our planting populations lower and lower. There's a lot of excellent data that shows that if you want to maximize your soybean yields, you have to be using a fungicide and insecticide treatment, especially as you keep dropping your soybean populations and you keep planting into cooler and wetter conditions. Now, there's also another question here. Is there a time I shouldn't apply a PGR? Is it even better in an early spring? That's also an excellent question. So that's kind of a two-part question. The first one that I'll address is a PGR such as Ascend. Is it better in early spring? And the answer is absolutely. We find that the response out of it is better in cooler conditions and wetter conditions. Generally speaking, when we plant early, we know that we're going to have cooler and wetter conditions longer into that plant's life. So that's an excellent question. The other question, is there a
Kyle, can
time?
I add one thing?
Yes, go
Can I
right ahead,
add one
Mark.
thing there? So I think that's a great question. And what we've been able to do with our new Ascend Pro is to actually widen that window out, Kyle, a little bit to where we've actually took the amino acid derivative and actually extended that window a little bit more. So as we think about these PGR products, what we're trying to do is make sure we know we're trying to target early season stress mitigation, but sometimes when we're wrapping up our planting season, those stressful conditions, whether it be cool, wet soils, actually might have grown more favorable. But we've actually are making these PGR products more applicable in wider windows and wider areas for application.
Yeah, Mark did a great job. That's actually exactly where I was going to go, but I'm glad you jumped in there. The other one here that I think it's really important that the question was asked: is there a time I shouldn't apply a PGR? And I think that question is almost as important as why I should apply a PGR. We've done a lot of research over a number of years, and I think it's important anytime you ask you're looking at using a PGR is to ask your person that you're buying it from this question. One of the things that we've found about PGRs is it's important to make sure you have adequate fertility when you're using a PGR. That's exactly why Mark did a great job of explaining phosphorus, zinc. We have a good baseline of fertility. Where we want to be really careful using a PGR is sometimes people want to use it without starter fertilizer or on a soil that has really low fertility. Think of that kind of like a bodybuilder that's taking steroids, but they're forgetting to eat dinner. It's probably going to be a bad day when that happens. So, but that's almost goes back to that conversation we just had around the synergy of all these components. If you're using a starter with phosphorus and zinc, I think we can be very comfortable that using Ascend or Ascend Pro would be a great option. Now, let's jump forward one more step here. So we've talked a little bit about corn. We've talked a little bit about soybeans. But one other thing that we're going to talk about here is we're actually going to talk about killing weeds. So we're going to go from trying to keep a plant alive to how do you kill a plant? And as you think about it, controlling weeds early in the season is more difficult. Why is it more difficult? It's cooler, it's wetter. Conditions aren't optimum for photosynthesis early in the season. So what do we have to do? The thing to keep in mind is don't forget about using adjuvants if you're going to be spraying burn down applications. So like for example, in this example, we have Sharpen applied on both of these plots. On the plot on the left, you notice we have Exuro, which is a methylated seed oil adjuvant applied with the Sharpen. And you can really notice how that is improving the Sharpen activity in this example, we're looking at kochia control. So today, we've talked a little bit about corn. We've talked a little bit about soybeans. We've touched on, making sure that you have the right adjuvants in your application. Mark, how do we wrap all this together?
So, Kyle, great question. And as we come to a close here, if we put up our last slide, we're going to be looking at the fundamental 5 agronomic decisions. So if we think about research done by WinField United, these are 5 key areas that you can positively change your yield potential. So in our discussions we really focused on 4 influencing areas, but there also is a 5, and that's around your seed selection. We know when you pick out your seed, it's important to understand that your seed and your trait recommendations are also important for early season stress mitigation as well. So out of all those, we know that these 5 make a big impact on yield potential out there. So wrapping up here, we want to make sure that you talk to your local retailer about WinField United products, as well as the data that supports our recommendations. I think that's very key, is we have the data that's behind our recommendations to make sure we help minimize our early season stress, as well as increase our ability for our yield potential out there. Kyle.
So it looks like we have another question here. How do we know which adjuvant to use? Yeah, that's a good question. There's a couple things. The first thing is of course you always will look at a pesticide label. They'll list it right on the label what they want from an adjuvant standpoint. If you're still unsure, be sure to talk to your local WinField United retailer. They can help you sort out what adjuvants would fit into that category to make sure that you get the right product for the right for your specific situation. Yeah, good question. Well, we'll open it up to any other questions that we might have right now.
I don't see any here, Kyle, but we appreciate all the questions that have come in so far, and I think Kyle's going to wrap it up for us.
Yes, well, I just want to say thank you to everyone for attending today. If you have any more questions, of course, reach out to us. You can talk to your local WinField United retailer or check out more information at www.winfieldunited.com. So again, thanks for attending and have a wonderful day.